Today's panel will be chaired by the veteran journalist and award-winning journalist, Ms. Carmina Constantino Torres. Let's give her a round of applause, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am pleased to see that most of those that I've interviewed about this topic are here with us today. And I can only say that by the end of today, the end of this afternoon, I hope, or at least the hope is that we will all have that one direction to tread on, that one path that we will all take with regard to this issue. As was mentioned earlier, I'm Carmina Constantino Torres. I am a journalist, and I am, just like you, eager to hear from our panelists today. This afternoon, the panel will be delving into diplomacy, transparency, make that transparency initiatives, and international law, and how all three of these intersect to at least ensure that stability and order in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea is shaped. And as I said a while ago, hopefully after this afternoon's sessions, we will see that path that will be laid clear before us as to what that direction will be, because we are, of course, celebrating the 10th year of the Arbitral Award. And I guess many of you have the same question that I have in mind, and that is, okay, we have it, but what have we done? And hopefully that question will be answered after today. So let's begin. First, to present about learning the lessons of history, decades of PRC engagement on the South China Sea, we have Dr. Jeffrey Ordaniel, from the WPS Foundation and the Tokyo International University. Dr. J, as I'd like to call him. Please come over. There you go.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. 3 days ago, can I have the slides, please? 3 days ago, the Philippines and China engaged in back-to-back diplomatic talks, 24th foreign ministry consultations, and 11th bilateral consultative mechanisms on the South China Sea. While those meetings were happening in China, in the West Philippine Sea, the Philippine Coast Guard, led by Rear Admiral J. Tariela, conducted a maritime domain awareness patrol in our own EEZ. Justice Carpio and I were fortunate to have joined in that patrol. And while our diplomats were talking in Beijing or in China, during the MDA patrol, threatening radio challenges were issued from PLA warships. Flares were fired, and a Chinese air asset shadowed us in our own exclusive economic zone. There is no question about diplomacy being a necessity, but 24 rounds of bilateral foreign ministry consultations, 11 rounds of bilateral consultative mechanism, and over 30 years of engaging China on the South China Sea should have already taught us lessons that should guide how we deal with Beijing. So let me offer some lessons from history. Anyone who has taken an undergraduate class on diplomacy and foreign policy knows that one big function of foreign service, the foreign ministry, is institutional memory. Respectfully, however, some of the pronouncements from our foreign ministry, from our Department of Foreign Affairs, seem to indicate institutional amnesia. And that, to me, is dangerous. My observation as an academic is this: China does not approach the South China Sea as a problem to be solved, but as a strategic space to be gradually controlled. And we can only recognize that if we make use of our institutional memory, and we must learn the lessons, or the right lessons of history. So here are 5 lessons. First, let's talk about this. This was in 1995. China occupied the Mischief Reef. The Philippines, of course, complained. We went to ASEAN. We tried to internationalize the issue. What did China say? Let's listen to Wang Yi. At that time, he was Vice Foreign Minister, Currently, he is foreign minister. Sound, please.
I can be very responsible for all my friends here.
我可以负责任地告诉各位朋友，它完全是一个民用的设施。
I can be very responsible for all my friends here to say that that facility is completely for civilian purposes.
现在是这样，将来也是这样。
It is so right now, and it will also be so in the future.
我们该。
Big lie. Civilian purposes, it will be so then and in the future. We know that that's already false. So this is Ms. Chief Reef in 2017. So one of the clearest historical patterns in the South China Sea is the repeated divergence between what China says and what China does. This was taken in 2017, and you can see runways, several airplane hangars, missile silos, fighter jets, hardly things that fishermen need to shelter from bad weather or civilian purposes. In 2005, President Arroyo championed what IR scholars refer to as a policy of appeasement. She accommodated China's security preferences, negotiated with China in secret, came up with a joint marine seismic undertaking. She subjected many parts of our EEZ, including areas China has never been present before, like the Reed Bank, into this agreement. The agreement says that all seismic data acquired would be jointly owned and shared among the parties. The reality, China withheld key exploration findings from the Philippines. In 2012, there was a standoff. China, for the first time, interfered with a Philippine routine law enforcement operation in the Scarborough Shoal, and it resulted in a standoff. To resolve the standoff, there was a series of negotiations, and an agreement was reached. The agreement was for all ships on both sides to withdraw from the Scarborough Shoal by a certain hour. Let me quote our former Foreign Secretary, Albert Del Rosario. We withdrew our one ship while China deceitfully breached our agreement by not withdrawing their 30 or more ships. I'm not blaming Secretary Del Rosario here. In fact, I think Secretary Del Rosario remains to be our best foreign secretary. But my point here is China lied once again, and now they are in Scarborough Shoal, preventing our fishermen from entering the lagoon. In 2015, President Xi Jinping, right beside President Obama in Washington, D.C., said China does not intend to pursue militarization of the reclaimed features in the South China Sea. We know, again, that that's a lie. They have reclaimed, or they have militarized all the reclaimed features in the South China Sea. Now, every time China manufactures a tension in the West Philippine Sea, China would dangle bilateral talks and offer confidence-building measures. The goal is not to manage tension peacefully, but to solidify gains, create a false atmosphere of compromise and cooperation, and evade accountability. Hotlines, for example, China says, let's have hotlines for maritime incidents so that we can manage disputes or tensions as they arise. The reality, China could not be reached for several hours when the Philippines tried to use the hotline after the Chinese Coast Guard trained a water cannon at a Philippine boat in the West Philippine Sea in 2023. This is not a one-off event. In fact, many countries have noticed that China also established hotlines with them, but when the need was there to use that hotline, nobody picked up. And so that's lesson number one, recognize China's doublespeak. What is the lesson there? Obviously, your foreign policy and your approach to China should not be business as usual, because China has time and again demonstrated a lack of good faith.
Where unexpected restrictions on imports to China are weighing down on farmers' pockets.
There were so many rejection.
But more rejection than normal.
Yeah,
Why?
it's the one that we're discussing. It's my own opinion that maybe it's a result of our standoff or problem in Scarborough Shoal.
Farmer John.
There, China links issues. Even if we try to compartmentalize, history shows us that that is unlikely to happen. What frustrates me is every time a new administration comes in, we are almost back to zero when we deal with China, na parang walang institutional memory. For China, in terms of foreign policy, politics and territorial interests come first, everything else secondary. A few days ago, our own Secretary of Foreign Affairs said this: "It is our view in the Department of Foreign Affairs that we put aside the issues in the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea, because it is not the whole of our relations with China." Now, I have nothing against Secretary Lazaro. I've not met her. I don't know her personally, but I disagree with some of her policy priorities, because if we look at China's record, not just in dealing with our country, but in dealing with other countries in the world, the fact of the matter is China links issues. You have your issue with, they have their issue with Japan, for example. I'm not going to detail them, but most recently in 2026, this year, China banned dual-use exports to Japan after failing to get the Japanese Prime Minister to retract her comments about Taiwan. So there was a parliamentary debate in Japan, and the Japanese Prime Minister said that a Taiwan contingency is a Japanese contingency. China was so angry about that, they want the Japanese Prime Minister to apologize. Their diplomat in Osaka called for the Japanese Prime Minister to be beheaded. And now they're using economic coercion against Japan. The same thing happened in South Korea when China imposed informal sanctions, right? When South Korea said, let's host missile systems from the United States to cope with the North Korean nuclear missile issue, China says, all right, no more tourists to Korea, no more K-pop in China. In Australia, in 2020, China restricted high-value commodities because the Australian government called for an independent investigation of the COVID-19, which originated in Wuhan. In Norway, when the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to a human rights advocate, China also imposed sanctions on Norway. So the lesson here is, even though we want to compartmentalize our relationship with China, it's difficult to do, if not impossible to do, because politics first for China. And that relates to the third lesson: economic dependence on China is a vulnerability. Before the Iran conflict, the international community has been talking about decoupling with China, de-risking with China, and I think that's a lesson that we should still continue to pursue, to learn from. Finally, the fourth lesson, the last lesson that I would like to share, we have other lessons, of course, but just some of them I'd like to mention. Joint development is code for recognizing China's claim. So there is a renewed rhetoric about doing joint development with China. And we know for a fact that that's impossible to do. There had been numerous attempts in the past. Why previous attempts failed? Because China will never recognize Philippine jurisdiction and EEZ. China will never recognize the arbitral award. Second, the Philippines can never agree to a deal that violates the 60-40 provision of the Constitution. So what's the possible plan B? Service contract arrangement that was alluded to by Justice Carpio a while ago. But that means that any joint exploration in the South China Sea should adhere to the Constitution, should be operating under Philippine law. China will never agree to that. Possible plan C, joint exploration in areas outside Philippine EEZ, but inside the 9-dash line. The question there is, why would China do that? Or maybe plan D is joint exploration in areas inside Philippine EEZ, but outside the 9-dash line. I disagree with that. Why would we share our resources with a country that constantly coerces us? So those are some of the lessons that I think we should really take into account when we deal with China, rather than always going back to zero whenever we talk to them. And just like now, there are a lot of discussions about joint development, but have we resolved the fundamental disagreements? I don't think so. What's new, in other words? It just gives China ammunition for its propaganda, but it does not really solve our energy crisis. Thank you.
Sorry, this is my mic. Sorry. Thank you so much, Dr. Jeffrey or Danielle. There already. I listed maybe like 5 questions. So humanda ka po later pag sa panel discussion natin. But that last bit about his presentation, all about China and what we can do, if it's possible, in terms of partnership with China, is China the only one that we can partner with in that regard? So maybe that's one of the question as well, given that there's so many conditions and there's so many barriers regarding any partnership that we may want to have with China. Next, UNCLOS and the 2016 Arbitral Award, Anchor of Philippine Maritime Policy. Very interesting presentation about to come up. May I call on Ambassador Laura Del Rosario, retired, of course, from the DFA, also from the from the WPS Foundation. Ambassador.
Okay, after Jeffrey's talk and anticipating Dr. Rene de Castro's presentation, I don't think I have anything much to say. The only thing that I can mention is that diplomacy operates under international law. It is the ecosystem in which we operate, from our diplomatic immunity to rules of war to maritime law to outer space to psychotropic substances. Everything is negotiated. Therefore, we used international law to get into an even playing field against China in the conflicting maritime zones on the West Philippine Sea after the 2012 Scarborough Shoal incident. The only thing that I'm worried about here, after our arbitration award, is that we have to be wary of the people within. Before I go there, let me just trace what has happened so far. From President Aquino, who thought that right is might, to President Duterte, who diminished the significance of the ruling to the extent of describing it as a mere piece of paper, the Philippine actions and position for and against international law brought out the important fact: diplomacy should be a part of our statecraft in our international relations. Sometimes in the discussion of all these conflicts, we forget that there is a tool in our statecraft tool, which is diplomacy. Secretary Año called for limiting space for malign influences. So I'm here to talk about expanding space for diplomacy. The problem with our position now as diplomats is that because of President Duterte's position in 2016, he almost obliterated everything that we could have used to expand our, our control over what is happening in the South China Sea. We wasted 8 years, or how many years? 12, 13, when we could have demonstrated how democracy can be, how diplomacy can be used to obtain international support for our legal win. So far, we only have 30 explicit declarations of support, and the ASEAN members are not even there. There's one thing that President Duterte did not know. China respects those who stand by their principles. China doesn't like sycophantic behavior. And as Cesdrelon said, do we have political will? If we show that we do have political will, maybe we'll gain a little respect from China. Let me go back to 2012 after the Scarborough Shoal incident. Because of that, and after the Foreign Ministry of China dealt with our foreign officials with rudeness, almost talking down to them as though they were small children, we removed all interaction with the Chinese. Ambassador Garcia is here, Ivan Garcia, and he was my counterpart in the Political Affairs Policy Office, and I was in charge of economic policy. And the rule then was, nobody talks to the Chinese ambassador, nobody meets with any Chinese official, nobody attended National Day receptions, nobody gave any time to the Chinese officials here. Everything was done through Beijing, our embassy in Beijing. The only one allowed to talk to the Chinese at that time was me. Maybe because I look harmless, I'm short, at the same time. I wasn't doing political, I was doing economic. But this was in 2012. In 2015, Xi Jinping attended APEC. Please note that. He attended. And at the end of the summit meeting, he told Cabinet Secretary Rene Almendras he had a wonderful visit in Manila. So did we accomplish something? Symbolically, yes. All right? But note that no high-level delegation tried to mollify China between 2012 to 2015. We did not do anything to really court them to attend. But at the same time, we also had to pay a high price for it because communications was limited only to our embassy in Beijing and in my office. We incapacitated our ambassador in China. Ambassador Sonia Brady suffered a stroke, and we had to bring her home, and she never recovered her ability to speak until she died last year. Our second ambassador under President Aquino was Ambassador Erlinda Basilio. She came home in a wheelchair. Please note that these two lady ambassadors served as undersecretaries before they were assigned to China. So they knew the rules. They knew how it should be played. But the stress and pressure was so strong, they had to suffer physically. During President Duterte's time, he assigned Chito Santa Romana. He completed his tour of duty, but while he was preparing to return to the Philippines, he had to undergo, what they call that, COVID-19 quarantine. He died before the quarantine was over. In other words, he came home in a coffin. So those of us in the Foreign Service knew what price we have to pay to protect our rights and to protect our sovereignty. As I said, it's the battle within that's harder to fight. Though I don't know everything about what happened between 2013 to 2015. If you recall, there was a senator, underline the word senator, who was sent or who went to China on a confidential mission. He never told Ambassador Brady what his meetings were about. We didn't know who arranged his meetings in China and how did he go in that confidential mission unless somebody from the top supported him. Definitely it wasn't President Aquino. Now, there's a senator who's promoting joint development programs, right? And definitely, it's again from within. So what I'm trying to say is that we have a disunited front versus the united front of China. The reported ban on our banana exports, which was featured today, came from the provincial producers who carried the story that their products were being banned in China. Dole and Del Monte did not experience such bans. What happened was that these small producers did not follow the WTO rules and phytosanitary rules on agriculture exports. I'm not blaming our exporters, But what I'm saying is that the Chinese found a loophole to ban them, and definitely China links economics with politics. During the time of President Aquino, we made sure that the Chinese did not invest in the Philippines. At that time, the Chinese investments in the Philippines were around 200 million, and we kept them at 200 million. The instructions were, don't allow Chinese investments to come in because they will use them as pressure points for us to comply with whatever they want. Okay, we have to be careful though these days that as we were very clear then what we wanted from the Chinese and what we did not want, we have to be very careful that we do not give a message of, quoting Dr. Jeffrey or Daniel, a message of ambiguity on the exercise of our rights and sovereignty, as in the case of the rotation and resupplying agreement. As pointed out by him, the deal sidelines the 2016 arbitral award. He also said that the agreement risks rewarding coercion and creating a precedent that could be repeated elsewhere. Justice Carpio said that right now we are not really facing a dead end. There are many ways we have to move forward. And perhaps you are not like me, who grew old in the Foreign Service. We are there for the long haul. It took 8 to 9 years to finish UNCLOS 3. You know that, we were informed yesterday. You are aware that beyond borders, beyond biodiversity, beyond national jurisdiction, or the High Seas Treaty, it took 18 years to negotiate that. It went into force just last month or 2 months ago in January. And at the same time for us, in diplomacy, we don't look at 1 year, 2 years, we look at 10 years. And in this case, we have to look far beyond maybe some of us in our lifetime. Justice Carpio said, sometimes some issues are generational, and this could be one of them. Please note that we have opened many consular and diplomatic posts the past 3 years. When I left the Foreign Service, there were only about 72 of them. Now there are 103. Can you imagine the addition of more than 30 posts within 3 years? Now we have what we call places who can bring forward our message and who can somehow influence the host country about what we stand for, and perhaps expand and deepen the alignment of many countries with us in our quest for justice on our case on the West Philippine Sea. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Laura. I mean, such is diplomacy, right? The ambassador there said a lot of things without really saying a lot of things, but we got it, right, Justice Tony? We knew what she was saying. So maybe later, Ambassador Laura, maybe I'll ask you later. So if it's very clear what the Aquino position was, and it's very clear as well what the Duterte administration's position was, is it so clearly opaque what the Marcos administration's position is? Maybe you can answer that later on as we discuss this even more. It's very clear as well what the ambassador said, that yes, it's a dance. Diplomacy is a dance, right? A delicate dance. But we're seeing right now that it's no longer just a dance, it's a cotillon, if you know that. So many other dancers on the floor. In the beginning of the Marcos administration, we saw a shift. There was transparency and reporting. We all of a sudden knew what was happening in the high seas. And this is what our next speaker is going to be talking about. He'll be talking about doubling down on transparency at sea. Let's all welcome, from the Philippine Coast Guard, Rear Admiral J. Tariela.
Good afternoon, everyone. Since I have very limited time and we have a moderator who will cut me off if I exceeded my time, I would like to get straight to the point. I will answer the question, why do we need transparency in the West Philippine Sea? Is it merely for raising awareness, or is there more to it? Secondly, after more than 3 years of this policy, during which we have seen an unaffected, unapologetic China, and with Filipinos now far more aware, why do we still need to push for transparency? Before I begin, I would like to share some videos that we have published over the past 3 years. The first video shows the China Coast Guard using a military-grade laser against the Philippine Coast Guard vessel while it was patrolling the Second Thomas Shoal in February of 2023. The high-intensity beam caused temporary blindness for the Coast Guard sailors when they were directly hit. The next video captures more than 110 Chinese maritime militia vessels swarming Rizal Reef, which lies well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. This next video, you will see China Coast Guard behaving like bandits at Second Thomas Shoal, where they confronted our outnumbered Navy personnel with threats of violence, brandishing axes and knives last June 17 of 2024. In the next video, you'll see a China Coast Guard deliberately ramming BRP Teresa Magbanwa while it was safely anchored in Skoda Shoal, more than 100 nautical miles from Palawan. We also have footage showing how China has militarized and illegally reclaimed Subi Reef and Mischief Reef, which now serve as military forward deployment bases of the People's Republic of China. Here are Chinese research vessels that are conducting illegal MSR without the permission of the Philippine government. In this video, you will see a dangerous maneuver conducted by a PLA Navy helicopter that came alarmingly close to the Coast Guard aircraft conducting a legitimate maritime domain awareness flight over Bajo de Masinloc. And of course, the most dangerous and widely reported incident is the footage of the PLA Navy colliding with a China Coast Guard vessel while they were chasing a Philippine Coast Guard vessel in Bajo de Masinloc last August 11. Finally, this video shows the China Coast Guard directly firing a water cannon against a wooden hull indigenous Filipino fishing boat in Skoda Shoal last December. This was the first time that the China Coast Guard used its direct jet stream water cannon against the Filipino fishermen. These videos offer only a glimpse of how we have been exposing China's bullying tactics and aggressive actions in the West Philippine Sea. As you watch them, I believe most of the audience will recognize two key points. First, many of these incidents are already familiar from what you have read or heard. And second, we can all agree that these actions deserve strong criticism and condemnation because they clearly endanger the safety and threaten the regional peace that we all enjoy. Over the past 3 years, the Philippine government has taken the lead in exposing Chinese gray zone activities in the entire South China Sea. What were once described as gray zone tactics are now rightly viewed in the Philippines as overtly illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive actions that must be brought to the attention of both the Filipino people and the international community. For our domestic audience, it is essential that Filipinos clearly recognize China's bullying and aggressive behavior. This awareness is the best defense against flood of fake news and disinformation spread by the People's Republic of China. That same misinformation has fueled a defeatist narrative championed by our former president that standing up for our sovereign rights and sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea would inevitably lead to a war or invasion. Yet, recent surveys tell a different story. 9 out of 10 Filipinos support the government's transparency initiative in the West Philippine Sea. For the international community, the stakes are equally high. World leaders cannot effectively support or hold China accountable if they remain uninformed about the true situation in the South China Sea. While raising global awareness, it helps us build support for our capabilities. Our core objective is simpler: to demonstrate to like-minded states that it is China, not the Philippines, that escalate the tension and violates international law. It is worth noting that for 3 consecutive years now, the G7 leaders have explicitly referenced South China Sea and China's unlawful conduct in their joint statement. However, despite these successes of the Transparency Initiative, many Filipinos are not just merely aware, they have increasingly angered by Chinese aggression. They ask why the government seems content merely to publicize these incidents of harassment. They argue that reputational damage alone cannot stop China from bullying our fishermen and that we must do more. While I understand their frustration, I firmly believe that we must continue and even intensify our transparency policy for 5 compelling reasons. I'm going to use caricature, but I'm not going to put the face of their president. I might end up having another diplomatic protest. So I'll be referring to China as a dragon. Aggression is rising and not receding, and silence only invites more of it. The frequency and intensity of Chinese coercive actions in the West Philippine Sea have increased markedly over the past several years, from dangerous water cannon to blocking maneuver against our resupply vessels to repeated incursion into our exclusive economic zone. The more China escalates, the more imperative it becomes to expose every single incident to the world. The notion that remaining silent in the face of such bullying will somehow make Beijing more cooperative or willing to engage in peaceful negotiation is dangerously misguided. On the contrary, secrecy or silence only emboldens China further, because the international community will never know the full extent of its unlawful behavior. Second, the battlefield has decisively shifted to the information domain, where China's FEMI operations are intensifying. The People's Republic of China has dramatically ramped up its foreign interference and manipulation information campaign, turning the information space into the primary theater of conflict over our sovereignty and sovereign rights. The real contest is no longer fought solely at sea. It is now being waged through coordinated waves of fake news, distorted narratives, and sophisticated disinformation designed to divide Filipinos, erode public confidence in our own legal position under the 2016 Arbitral Award, and ultimately threaten our national resolve to defend what is rightfully ours. Third, transparency demonstrably delays and disrupts China's long-term illegal plans in the South China Sea. By consistently deploying media and press, our friends from the media and journalists, to monitor and report the Chinese activities such as at Bajo de Masinloc, we have forced Beijing to pause, recalibrate, and postpone the execution of its unilateral fait accompli. A clear example is the Chinese repeated attempts to declare the so-called nature reserve or other administrative measure that would further restrict Philippines' access in Bajo de Masinloc. Every time our vessels, accompanied by independent journalists, arrive to document these activities, China is compelled to scale back or delay its illegal operations. Fourth, transparency equips our policymakers and hopefully our legislators as well with accurate, timely, and comprehensive information essential for sound decision making. In an environment as complex and fast evolving as the West Philippine Sea, our executive agencies, the Congress, and other stakeholders cannot craft effective strategies or even pass informed legislation or allocate resources wisely without steady flow of verified real-time data. Transparency ensures that every water cannon incident, every illegal blocking maneuver, and every encroachment is meticulously documented, not just for public consumption, but for internal use by those who must weigh policy options, engage in bilateral talks, or even prepare for multilateral forums. Lastly, transparency keeps the Filipino public engaged and reminds voters that leadership choices have lasting consequences. By keeping the spotlight on Chinese aggression, we ensure that our people remain vigilant and informed, fostering a deeper understanding that the defense of our maritime rights is not an abstract foreign policy issue, but a matter that directly affects our fishermen's livelihood, our food security, our energy security, and even our national dignity. If the government were to fall silent, however, Filipinos known for their forgiving and forward-looking nature risk forgetting the pattern of coercion and the high stakes involved. Transparency counters this natural tendency toward forgetfulness, compelling citizens to think critically when electing leaders and to hold future administration accountable for continuing the firm, principled stand that the current policy represents. In the long run, an informed and engaged electorate becomes our strongest guarantee against any backsliding on our sovereignty. In conclusion, transparency is not a substitute for stronger action, I would agree, but it is the essential foundation that sustains domestic unity, international support, and the long-term defense of our sovereign rights. And for that, we must stay course. Maraming salamat po at mabuhay ang bagong Pilipinas.
So nice to hear from Rear Admiral J. Tariala being so transparent and speaking his mind out during this administration. Mamaya, later on, Rear Admiral, I will ask you because he was also part of the Duterte administration. I want to know, and wouldn't you want to know as well, what the orders were given to them then, why they were silent, and why the shift? Because I want to know. Kayo magtatanong. I'm just seeding you the question now, but I'll ask it later. All right, next up, how do we ensure that engagement does not become appeasement, right? This is going to be the focus of our next speaker, Dr. Renato Cruz de Castro from De La Salle University. And I have to say, one of my favorite resource persons in any program that I've hosted. Professor.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. But before I start my presentation, I won't have a PowerPoint presentation. It will be extemporaneous, sharing to you my thoughts regarding this very interesting subject matter. You know, I want to thank Dr. Ordanel and, of course, Admiral Tariela for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts regarding this important topic. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just an ordinary teacher, professors, and of course, aside from enlightening the lives of our students, in my case, they provide me information that is not readily available. One information that I got from a student of my graduate student who worked at the Chinese embassy told me that the Chinese embassy has a list of anti-China academics. The top three are here. Okay, one is directly in front of me, number one, so he get the gold medal. Second, of course, is wearing a Coast Guard uniform, silver medal. I'm a poor number three. So what basically accounts for that? You know, I count not really anti-China, but critical from my professor way back in the 1980s, who is a historian, well-known historian, who at that time already perceived that China will be a threat not only to the Philippines, to the region. It was a couple of years after, of course, Deng Xiaoping announced the four modernization. I'm talking about the late Professor Renato Constantino, of course, was the grandfather of our MC. So basically planted that seed that was very prophetic in a way that how we see China at this point in time. So Jeff gave me a topic of ensuring engagement does not become appeasement. I actually prepared a presentation, a case study that will not, of course, be a case of appeasement, but later I realized, you know, at the end of the day, if you have to look at the three administration that I'll be discussing, appeasement has always been part of Philippine foreign policy from the time of the late President Benigno Aquino III up to the current president. It's always there. It's part and parcel. But before I discuss, of course, appeasement and, of course, engagement, I have to discuss in terms of general concepts. Of course, number one is engagement. Engagement is a form of interaction. States interact with one another because you want to determine outcome. States are not just legal entity that subscribe to international law. I'll basically adopt the German view. States are also element of power. States, of course, has the monopoly of legitimate violence. Importance, of course, of the military capability. So interaction would range from diplomatic, just simple communication, and of course, even in terms of military capability. But the point of appeasement is, of course, is another concept. General, of course, appeasement pertains to giving concession to an emerging aggressive power. In front of me, of course, we have two gentlemen from the United Kingdom that basically was talk about, of course, the Munich appeasement. We refer to Neville Chamberlain, the classic Munich. Of course, we have a German here. So we talk about the Munich appeasement that happened in 1938. And that, of course, gave the negative connotation of appeasement, right? Again, going back, of course, case of Czechoslovakia over Sudetenland. And, of course, they were laughing among themselves, but that's the case of Europe. So, of course, you have Czechoslovakia was willing to fight. Initially, of course, Britain and France were supporting Czechoslovakia over Sudetenland until, of course, the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, Neville Chamberlain, decided to go to Munich and cut a deal with Hitler. You know, basically telling the Czech, you have to give in Sudetenland for the sake of peace. Because, again, the term used by Neville Chamberlain, Czechoslovakia is a faraway country. Then coming back, of course, to London at that time, peace in our times. 2 years later, of course, you have Second World War, 1939. So that gave appeasement a negative connotation. Opposite, of course, appeasement is balancing. You challenge. You build up your military capability, and of course, you also rely on alliance, which, of course, Neville Chamberlain and by 1939 realized appeasement simply emboldened the aggressor. And unfortunately, of course, if you look at foreign policy from the time of the Aquino administration up to the present, you always have that element of appeasement. You know, what basically accounts for this? You have to understand, of course, the nature of our engagement in terms of the Philippines and China. It's not simply an engagement of two equal powers or a country that's supposed to be undermining the rules-based international order. We're talking about an emergent revisionist power that basically looks at the equation in a totally different light in contrast, of course, to the Philippines. Let me give you this example. China, of course, under President Xi Jinping has adopted what you call, and nobody has discussed this, a grand strategy based, of course, on unraveling what it perceived as, an American system where, of course, you have the United States being the offshore strategic balancer, providing, of course, the forward deployed forces in the waters of the first island chain and the first guarantor of security. In 2012, President Xi Jinping announced the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. What is the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation? China, there should only be one power in the region. all Asian problems had to be resolved by Asian alone, similar to what the Japanese said, of course, in 1941. So we haven't understood it. The strategy of the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation has two very important components. Number one, of course, creating the situation where, of course, you'll have harmony, you have interaction among the countries. That's why you have the Belt and Road Initiative. You have China trying to assume, of course, greater economic, becoming basically the center of the economic, dynamism here. And more importantly, of course, the fact that China announced the three core interests. No one has talked about the three core interests. Three core interests means China will use every power at this disposal to protect these three core interests. What are these three core interests? Number one, the most important, for the Chinese, the core of core interests, Taiwan. Rejuvenation and possible armed unification with Taiwan by next year. Then, of course, Tibet, that's always been again. And the third one, of course, is the South China Sea. So we have here people here in the Philippines. The South China Sea is not the sum total of our relationship with China. That goes against the very grain of the Chinese view regarding the South China Sea. For China, the South China Sea is one of the three core interests. That China would use force. China will not build the largest navy in the world. They'll develop the largest ship building industry of the world if China does not intend to control the South China Sea, Taiwan, and possibly what they call the waters of the first island chain. The term first island chain, of course, has been mentioned in the national security strategy under the Trump administration, recognizing the fact that China's emergence here constitute a grave threat to American national interests. We can discuss basically what's the concept of the first island chain. Now, of course, in the case of the Philippines, we only look at it in terms of a territorial dispute, which is natural. But for the Chinese, as Jeff said, we're simply part of the China's strategic puzzle that China would eventually try to resolve, but will have to look in terms of the larger picture. The larger picture, of course, is to control the waters of the first island chain to push American strategic presence out of the first island chain. First island chain, of course, constitute Japan, Taiwan, and of course, south is the Philippines. So we have to understand Chinese game plan in terms of what they announced. China's grand interest of the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation, which basically involves dominating the region in terms that there will be only one power in the region, and that is, of course, our big, powerful, aggressive, and expansionist neighbor. Again, thank you very much to your grandfather for that thoughts. But we see how did Philippines historically, the three administration had basically addressed this. In all their policy, you always see the element of appeasement, even starting with the late President Benigno Aquino III. Early part, you remember when Secretary Hillary Clinton announced in Hanoi that the United States has vital interests in the South China Sea. The first secretary, not the late Secretary Albert de Rosario, the carryover, Secretary Romulo said, we don't want the United States involved in this issue. So all the time, of course, the Aquino administration was trying to cut a deal. We don't simply have enough time to discuss how it basically turned sour, how he realized that appeasing China simply would not work. You have efforts, of course, for joint development, but first he said, let's try to delimit. Let's determine what will be the limits of the China's expansion claim. China, of course, refused to adhere to that until, of course, you have the Scarborough Shoal incident. So what are the elements, of course, of shifting into balancing? Number one, of course, is strengthening our alliance with the United States, modernization of the armed forces of the Philippines, and something very crucial. I think this will be the lasting legacy of the Aquino administration, the July 12, 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling. I will not look at it in terms of a lawyer. I'm not. I would look at it in terms of strategic. It basically deprived China of any legitimacy in terms of its expansion, basically showing to the world China's action in the South China Sea is a clear, simple geostrategic expansion. So I use the term Chinese maritime expansion. Let's go, of course, to the Duterte administration. So early on in the Duterte administration, of course, classic appeasement. When it's decided that we have to set the ruling aside after the ruling came out, 2 weeks after, of course, he assumed the presidency. Then, of course, announcing in Beijing I'm separating from the United States. China and Russia, here I come, basically announcing that all military exercises with the United States would end, trying to, of course, court the Chinese. You know, when you have the siege of Marawi happening, instead of approaching Washington, he approached China and asked China and Russia, bring in weapons. But of course, eventually, the Duterte administration realized appeasement was not working. The money that President Xi Jinping promised him, $25 billion that China promised him in October, when he was there in Beijing, 2016, never materialized. Chinese harassment continued in the South China Sea, so forth and so on. So eventually, of course, he realized whether we appease China or challenge China, we get the same result, subjugation. It's a common notion that, there was a dramatic change with the Marcos administration. No. By the last 2 years of the Duterte administration, there was a realization. Appeasement was not working. Please remember, he started to ask the Trump administration for security guarantee. Then, of course, he approved the modernization program of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. And interestingly, in 2019, the Armed Forces of the Philippines came out with the 2019 National Military Strategy, which points out that China is a military threat. That document was released during the Duterte administration. Go back. I have enough time. How many more? Okay. So you have the Marcos administration trying to balance, but at the end of the day, the Marcos administration again realized the lesson. It's not worth appeasing China. So in fact, what I would argue is that the Marcos administration came out with the hardest policy. After, of course, a realization, the first 3 months, appeasing China does not work, strengthening the alliance with the United States. Again, before he assumed the position, said, I'm reaffirming the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal ruling. And of course, for the first time in our history, we came out with a grand strategy called the Comprehensive Archipelagic Defense Concept, which actually provides the military capability behind international law and diplomacy. And again, people talk about diplomacy, but we have forgotten the classic dictum of Frederick the Great when you talk about diplomacy. Diplomacy, another German, of course, without the military capability is just like conducting music without the instrument. So that's basically the point we have. I'll just go to the general. So what's now the current policy at this point in time? It's classic balancing. Characterized, of course, by the acceptance after so many years, ever since we discovered Chinese structure on Mischief Reef, that China presents the clear and present danger to Philippine national security. Number two, of course, is trying to maintain the status quo in the South China Sea through the Arbitral Tribunal ruling, so forth and so on. The acceptance, the fact that we have to build an armed forces that geared for archipelagic defense. Of course, reliance on alliances. But at the end of the day, of course, we ask the question, why does appeasement happen every now and then? You have to understand 3 factors. Number one is our electoral politics. Every time we elect a new president, the new president would think, well, appeasement would work. The fact that deal with China, we can cut the deal with China. Number two, of course, is the fact that as a liberal democracy, we have people here. We even have, of course, politicians or what we call senador or some academics who believe that it's worth cutting a deal with China. That's normal in any liberal democracy. Last, of course, in fact, we have to take into account. China is not like the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I still remember the Soviet Union had a first world military capability, but of course, a third world economy. China is different. China, of course, has a first world economy, and China could basically offer us, of course, carrots and, of course, sticks. So this accounts for the fact that every now and then in our liberal democratic system, the element or the iota of appeasement would come out every now and then. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much to Professor Renato de Castro. At this point, we'd like to call on the panelists on stage, our speakers. Dr. Jeffrey Ordaniel, Ambassador Laura Del Rosario, Rear Admiral Jay Tariela to join Dr. De Castro here on stage. And while they're doing that, I just want to make a mention and call the attention of our gold medalist, Professor Jay Batong Bakal. I really want to ask you, I mean, how does it feel that, you know, you have all these people now talking, but you and I, it was very lonely during that time, our interviews, and now you're no longer that lone voice. Can we give a mic to Professor Jay Batong Bakal while we're waiting? No longer, no longer the lone voice.
Yeah. Well, certainly it's comforting. No? And when you look back at Love the Sea advocacy, I mean, it goes back even further. I was a weirdo back in the 1990s when it started on this, and raising awareness was a long, difficult road when you're basically alone. No, but as time went on, it's quite encouraging to see that things change. It took a generation, basically, 25 years, but that's still something. No? And now I'm sort of pleased that not only here, but even back in the university, we have a lot more people, a lot more academics engaged in the topic, and not only in law, also in the sciences, also in the social sciences. So that's very, what you call this, fulfilling in a way. And I hope that this keeps on. So we continue to advocate for raising awareness about our maritime and archipelagic nation, and people here as well who, actually some people here who were sort of constrained from speaking out, with whom I was dealing with before, finally now have that leeway and that freedom. And the society is much more open, much more aware and knowledgeable. It's a very, very big difference between the 1990s and now. So
thank you so much. And I'm going to jump off from there, and I want to go straight to Rear Admiral Jay Tariela. Okay, thank you, ma'am. So a while ago, while you were making your way out, I was like, it's so refreshing to hear from you during the Marcos administration. What were the orders given to you during the Duterte administration? Why were you so quiet? All of these things started happening then. Please be honest with us. What were the orders then?
I really appreciate Ms. Carmina doing all this, hosting this panel. I personally requested Jeffrey to have Ms. Carmina.
Are you now doubting? Are you now doubting yourself? Okay.
Well, first of all, that question was asked to me during the first few days of the transparency efforts. Our media friends were asking, like, where were you during the time of the Duterte years? Why all of a sudden you become one of the loudest voices to expose Chinese aggression? What were you doing way back in 2016 to 2022? I have a very good excuse for not being here and not being so loud to expose Chinese aggression. I was in Tokyo from 2015 to 2016. I was doing my master's, and from 2017 to 2021, I was doing my PhD.
But you were still part of the organization.
I was
right, Justice Tony?
I was part of the organization, ma'am, but I'm out of the country. Even if I'm going to write something.
Oh, ito na lang. Sa atin lang. No one's here. Of course you heard something, right?
Well, I cannot hear anything about the West Philippine Sea as to the guidance of the president then. But
let me remind you, your presentation a while ago was all about transparency.
Yes, but I won't deny the fact, in comparing the policy of the previous administration, that they decided to silence the efforts of the armed forces of the Philippines, the harassment of the Filipino fishermen, and even the Philippine Coast Guard. In a lot of my speaking engagement, I highlighted the fact that from 2016 to 2022, there were only 3 incidents that were publicized. The first one was in 2019 when the Filipino fishermen from Mindoro reported that they were deliberately rammed and they were left to die. In 2021 March, when the Philippine Coast Guard exposed the presence of more than 200 Chinese maritime militia in Julian Felipe Reef, which was also contested by our best spokesperson, Attorney Harry Roque, back then, saying that we don't have to worry about that because Julian Felipe Reef is outside our exclusive economic zone. But it's not correct. Julian Felipe Reef falls within our own exclusive economic zone. In November of 2021, when Secretary Delfin Lorenzana himself publicized in his social media account condemning the Chinese use of water cannon. So I never denied the fact that the entire 6 years of the Duterte administration, they tried to downplay and also silence the efforts of the people on the ground to talk about the Chinese aggression.
Thank you for your honesty. Let me just go back to the presentation of Dr. Jeffrey here, Dr. J as I call him. I mean, it was very clear in your presentation that it's lie after lie after lie after lie. Having said that, let me now go to Ambassador Del Rosario. If it's lie after lie after lie after lie, why do you believe them still?
I did not.
What was your thought process then? You knew that it was the relationship was based lie after lie after lie. But if you didn't, why didn't you believe them? And why do you think those who were in power recently, and do you think those who are in power now are still believing these lies?
You know, my belief is that those who believe the lies were receiving dark money. Right? Even now, why aren't we united? Why don't we have a united front? Those who are in the disunited front, what do they have to gain? That's just a simple question. And I think everybody knows the answer, right?
But what is your proof that led you to believe that they were receiving dark money?
Lifestyle.
Can you give us a name? And can you, naku, nagtakip na ng ballpen. But can you, okay, if you can't give us a name, can you give us a clear description? Is there a letter?
No. Look, they come, even from the academe, Rene knows that. There are people from the
Nandamay pa.
Yeah, right? No, except Rene, of course. For us, Rene is an American agent.
Okay, so
I'm just kidding.
you saw the change in lifestyle and
Yeah.
already you...
And over eagerness in promoting. For instance, I was in the academic world then. Why is it so many people were being invited to go to China on a study mission? What for, right? And one promoting it, I said, what does he have to gain by doing that? And then, of course, even President Duterte, why did he suddenly flip? They said it's because personal. He didn't like the Americans because of a visa issue, because of personal history. It's more than that, don't you think?
No, but
Because
why?
if you look at the personal, I'm sorry,
go
if you look at the personal thing, President Aquino had a right to be anti-American because of the way President Marcos treated his father. And Marcos was supported by America as a dictator. Why is it he didn't go there? He didn't go that far.
But then there are so many other options, so many other explanations. Why do you zero in on money?
Because as President Ferdinand Marcos said, every Filipino has a price tag. I'm still trying to figure out how much I will cost.
You are priceless, let me tell you that.
MasterCard will do.
The follow-up question, do you think that there are sitting senators who have figured out their price tags?
Yeah. I think the Chinese have figured out their price tags. Dali eh.
Paano ba? Paano madali? Paano madali? Okay, so let me just go now to Dr. J. When you said it's lie after lie after lie, from the outside looking in, I mean, Ambassador Laura already said There's dark money involved. Do you know that as well? And what could be the explanation why they are vulnerable, why it's so easy for these people to figure out what their price tags are and very willingly dance the dance with China?
That's a difficult question for me because I mostly work in the policy space. So I don't really engage with FEMI scholarship, right? So what I emphasize in my research and policy engagement is the Philippine interest and the Philippine policy, that if we do not learn from history, we will continue to fall into this cycle.
But if the policy is being shaped by people who have their price tags already figured out, wouldn't that make your job harder?
That's right. It's harder. But also, I don't think that maybe there are policymakers in the Senate, in the Congress that are being bought. But I think in the foreign ministry, a vast majority of our people there are still doing the work out of love of country. So in fairness to them, we have diplomats who are really committed to doing the work. But obviously, they are limited to what their principal is telling them. So.
Okay, a while ago in the presentation of Ambassador Laura, Professor De Castro, she basically laid it out that it was very clear, Aquino administration, what their policy position was, Duterte administration policy position was. Having heard everything today and knowing what you know as well, what is, to you, the policy position of this administration?
At this point in time, it represents basically, I will consider the hardest, not only in terms of the transparency initiative, because for the first time in our history, we have come out with a grand strategy, the comprehensive archipelagic defense concept. A grand strategy, in a way, is a preparation for possible conflict that reflects, of course, a really hard. Just two weeks ago, I had a very interesting discussion with a ranking official from the Department of Foreign Affairs, was arguing that the Philippines is hedging. We're not hedging. In the fact that we have this plan. This plan involves basically building up the Navy, the Coast Guard, and of course strengthening our alliance. A few weeks from now, we will have a Balikatan exercise with the Japanese, with the Australians, with the Canadians, and they don't call it anymore exercise. We call it the rehearsal. The same way as U.S. Indo-PACOM Admiral Sam Paparo described the Chinese, military drills around Taiwan as a rehearsal. Again, this is, of course, in the light that we don't only face a threat of China from the South China Sea, we also face the China threat north of Luzon, which is, of course, Taiwan. If China would effect its armed invasion of Taiwan by 2027, as, of course, projected by no less than President Xi Jinping, we'll be faced by two major potential flashpoints. South China Sea, then of course Taiwan. And of course in the case of Taiwan, we have 250,000 Filipinos there in Taiwan. How can we evacuate those Filipinos?
Later on, I'm going to ask you about your presentation, which is about appeasement. Is appeasement, should it be done from a position of strength, or should it be done or is it being done now from a position of weakness, because you can have different results with regard to that? But because you said that, I'm just reminded of a question that I wanted to ask Dr. Ordaniel. Recently, you published a piece in the Philippine Daily Inquirer raising concerns about the idea of pursuing additional provisional understandings with China in other features of the West Philippine Sea. The DFA has pushed back strongly regarding that, even describing your position as malicious. First of all, was it malicious, and how did you receive that pushback from the DFA saying that your position was malicious?
All right, so I said a while ago that I do not know Secretary Lazaro personally, but I was so alarmed by her answer to the question of one of the journalists in the room. I think it was from Rappler at large, Marites Vitug. She was asked, are we going to have more provisional understanding in other parts of the West Philippine Sea. And she said, hopefully, we could subject parts or other features. And so that alarmed me because the lesson for China here is very clear. Coercion produces concession. What is that concession? The implicit recognition of the 9-dash line. Now, if you're going to subject Escoda Shoal, Pag-asa, Sandy Cay to additional provisional arrangements, one day we would wake up, the 9-dash line is a reality already, right? So that's why I'm so against the policy of coming up with this provisional understanding in parts of our EEZ, because the arbitral award already decided that these maritime areas are no longer contested. They are inside our exclusive economic zone. China has no standing whatsoever. They can't tell us what we can do, what we cannot do, because, again, we have the sovereign rights and jurisdiction. So why do we treat them as if they have standing, as if they can tell us what we can and cannot do? Implicitly, even though the agreement says it does not prejudice Philippine position, as what I've learned from Justice Carpio, the act itself is what makes it really dangerous. So what prevents China from manufacturing a crisis elsewhere in Escoda Shoal? All right, let's coerce the Filipinos in Escoda Shoal, and then let's talk to the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. Let's have another provisional understanding there.
And then the cycle begins yet again.
Yes.
But here's the thing, should there be a cycle, Rear Admiral Tariala? Because like right now, we're talking about this, right? It's very clear to us in this room, the direction that we should take. But it's within this administration. We know what happened in the last administration. Is there a way to institutionalize everything that we're talking about right now so we won't be, pun intended, lost at sea once again?
Well, first of all, I believe, as what Justice Carpio always mentioned, our issue in the West Philippine Sea is intergenerational. This is not something that will go away in 2028 or even after our generation. It will still be a persistent issue that the next generation of Filipino people has to deal with. So if we're talking about institutionalization of the transparency, for example, I think we need to pass a law, and members of the Congress and also in the Senate are already pushing for the curriculum adjustment for our elementary and high school students, for them to understand the West Philippine Sea, for them to clearly comprehend the 2016 Arbitral Award. Although right now, we already have our initiative with Secretary Sonny Angara to have an adjustment of the curriculum for the 4th grade, 6th grade, and 10th grade this coming academic calendar. But the problem is, in 2028, should there be another president who's not a believer of the transparency effort of what we're fighting for in the West Philippine Sea, it will be easy for her or him to alter all this. So if we're going to pass a law that will make the educational curriculum of the younger people right now to clearly understand why we are fighting for the West Philippine Sea and what we're fighting for, I think that's the most important impact for us to institutionalize it.
I agree. I would have to agree, because that is the very core of my late grandfather, nationalist historian Renato Constantino, and which we are doing as well in the Constantino Foundation. It's to keep history alive because, you know, as you said, it's intergenerational. Just going back to the appeasement, it's very easy, right? If you say appeasement, okay, but appeasement from a position of strength is very different from appeasement from a position of weakness. Would you equate that? Where are we? And would you equate that with subservience?
Well, in terms of our relation with China, it will always be structural asymmetry. China has the second largest economy in the world. China, of course, has the largest navy in the world. And of course, we have to credit, you know, the traditional Chinese notion of statecraft. 2,000 years of civilization, when you talk about the art of war, Sun Tzu, how the civilization survived. And that's, of course, the exercise of statecraft that the Chinese Communist Party has basically perfected. So how they're able to divide society, how able to, basically create, buy a product. But in fairness to some academics I know who, are for appeasement. Again, we go back to the notion of appeasement. some people would basically adopt a policy of appeasement, not because they got money, but because they simply believe they don't want to go into war. For them, war is simply unthinkable. War is very devastating. So for them, the other option is that why not just give China the concession? Again, going back to 1938, from the idea of Neville Chamberlain. If you appease an expanding power, you basically, what was said then, Hitler was just like a baby. You give him a candy, and then, of course, he'll be pacified. But, of course, at the end of the day, especially if you're dealing with a country, an empire, basically, that has practiced the art of statecraft historically, appeasement is something that, China would basically eventually use against you. And they simply know how to use both money and, more importantly, the power of idea, even, of course, saying, we have this civilization for so many years. So we have basically, unlike the Americans, so forth and so on, so we provide you a more attractive option. So again, you cannot also discount Chinese soft power, especially if you have Confucius Institute, if you have scholarship in China, if you have been given a training in China and they presented you everything about Chinese civilization. By the end of the day, when you come back, no need for money. I'm basically convinced of the Chinese narrative because they offer peace. It's a civilization that has been there since time immemorial. I remember what Kissinger said when he was warning the Americans. China is not like the Soviet Union. China is a civilization. So this, again, is something that we cannot simply ignore. Money's there, but again, the attraction of you deal with, Chinese civilization as, of course, interpreted to you by the Chinese Communist Party.
I think it was during one of our interviews, Professor De Castro, when you told me that China doesn't negotiate or doesn't talk to weak nations. It respects strength the way it sees it in nations. And having said what Professor Renato De Castro just said there, Ambassador, I want to go to you. Do you still trust China?
No.
Why not?
Never. I never trusted China. In fact, I was ambassador to India. And people always ask me, would you rather trust the Indians or the Chinese? I think people are laughing because they know what I'm trying to drive at. But let me put it this way. I'm trying to get into us, okay? I'm now looking at us as a problem. I agree with the proposal that we educate our people. But remember, look at what happened to our textbooks. Why are we like this? The story of martial law was never in the textbooks because the Department of Education removed that portion. There is no Philippine history either, right?
Even the Philippine-American War, it wasn't
Yeah,
really
right.
until my...
Yeah, there's no Philippine
until my
history.
grandfather
They chopped
wrote
up
about it.
Philippine history into various years and grades. Instead, we have Asian history, right? We have world history. I said, why did you remove Philippine history? That's Department of Education. Meaning, you can use the institutions to subvert a people, right? That's why all of our ideas, it will depend, when will we stop being corruptible?
But here's the thing. I mean, a while ago you talked about diplomacy. How can you speak about diplomacy when there is no trust?
Yeah, but in diplomacy, it's a special group of people. That's why if we are musicians, we will be playing jazz. Diplomats are jazz players. We have no musical score,
Yeah.
but we know the rules of music.
Yeah, very, very improvised.
Yeah, we improvise according to what we see. But somehow, the theories should be very, very clear. Otherwise, we also can be bought.
Dr. or Danielle a while ago talked about the joint seismic undertaking in the 90s. History repeating itself. Now there's talk about the joint oil exploration. If things continue as they are, how do you think that's going to end?
I think there will be no joint exploration in the South China Sea. Any president, any president who would agree with that would face an impeachment offense, because the Supreme Court already decided that the JMSU signed in 2005 is unconstitutional. So you cannot repeat that. So what's the formula? You have the plans A, B, C, D that I've presented. None of those is realistic. China will never agree to any agreement that would recognize Philippine jurisdiction in its own EEZ inside the 9-dash line. So how do you
Should
move
we
forward?
be looking at another entity, another country, and not just China?
Yes, absolutely. Because I think if you look back when Secretary Del Rosario was still alive, he said this, that every time you talk to the Chinese about joint development, it always ends up with China telling the Philippines that what is ours, what is yours is also ours, but we are willing to share. So in that kind of setup, I don't think we can agree to that. No president will ever agree to that. And our constitution is clear that we cannot do that. So again, Justice Corp, you talked about the service contract arrangement, that maybe the Chinese companies could come in, serve as service contractors. That's fine, right? But that means they have to operate under Philippine law. They cannot do that.
And correct me if I'm wrong, there are existing service contracts already. And they're able to do that.
Not with the
correct?
Chinese, I think.
Not with the Chinese. We have existing, we don't have that.
We have with
Regional Malampaya was
in
Shell.
the Malampaya.
Yeah.
It was Shell.
Oh, okay. So we can, but it can be
That's
done.
outside the 9-dash line,
Yeah.
by the way. The Malampaya, correct me if I'm wrong, is outside the 9-dash line. So therefore, the Chinese cannot really, or they do not have the reason to prevent that drilling. But if we drill in the reed bank, we cannot, because they're preventing us from doing so unless we have the political will to really push for it and face, I don't know, coercion. They want to, probably they're offering to drill together with us. But again, that is not allowed under the Constitution unless they agree to be service contractors only.
All right. Let me just go back to Rear Admiral Tariala here. I mean, a while ago you had that caricature of the Chinese dragon, right? You're not going to get in trouble this time around. You had your excuse or your explanation as to why things were kind of silent during the Duterte administration. We appreciate the transparency and the candor, now even the humor. But I've been sensing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been sensing there's been some dialing down. That the voice of the Philippines regarding this matter, has been sort of dialed down, especially since at the beginning of this administration, right? Everyone was pointing to the Marcos administration to be the leading voice in fighting for UNCLOS and West Philippine Sea and all that, given that we're going to be chairing the ASEAN as well. But we haven't been hearing a lot of those lately. Ikaw naririnig namin, yes. But the statement a while ago about how Secretary Lazaro responded to a question about kinakabahan na si Rear Admiral about additional undertakings, is that what you called it, says a lot. So are you feeling something that you're not telling us?
Well, first of all, with regard to the transparency efforts of the Philippine Coast Guard, I don't think that you can argue that we are dialing down a bit. We're toning down the transparency efforts. I still do MDA flight. I still embed journalists. Last Saturday, Justice Carpio and I went to Pag-asa.
Would it be different if you had Secretary Lazaro, the alter ego of the president, on your side, or even the president himself leading this charge?
I will turn over that question to Ambassador Del Rosario. But as far as the Philippine government is concerned, I think we have a unity of efforts in, again, calling out the Chinese aggression. As to the approach of the Department of Foreign Affairs, because we are currently the ASEAN chair. I don't have any knowledge about that, but with regard to our efforts to expose Chinese aggression, it remains to be the same since the day that we started the Transparency Initiative.
I have a question for the four of you. Before, by the way, you guys can also, if you have a question, raise your hand. I will go to you and I will give you the mic. Is China a nation that should be feared? Is it the monster that you don't trust? A big monster that we should be fearful of? I mean, how do we see China really as a nation? Go ahead, Ambassador.
I think I already talked about the actors within. I'm more afraid of the people within because they can harm us. I mean, facing China, if we were united, will not be as fearsome or frightening, except that we're facing it, and here we are within. There are forces working within us that weakens us.
So that's the real monster to you.
Yeah.
Because China will do what it will do.
Yeah, definitely China will enforce the actors within. Yeah.
Dr. Daniel.
I think we gave China a chance. During the Duterte administration, I think the Philippines gave China a face-saving opportunity to comply with international law, to comply with the arbitral award without losing face, because obviously Duterte was doing everything he could to appease China, right? He was standing there in front of the Great Hall of the People in Beijing saying, I'm separating my country from the United States. All of those things did not mean anything. The Chinese did not reciprocate. So I think we gave them a chance, and I just see no indication that China is willing to compromise in the South China Sea. We talked about the provisional understanding a while ago. No other claimant state in the South China Sea has done that. The Malaysians insisted they will never agree to any agreement that would implicitly recognize the Nine-Dash Line. The Vietnamese, they're communist brothers of the Chinese, but they don't have any provisional understanding or any such deal inside Vietnamese EEZ inside the Nine-Dash Line. They have an agreement in the Gulf of Tonkin, but that's a legitimate dispute. They have an overlapping EEZ there. They don't have an overlapping EEZ in other parts of the South China Sea. So it's only us that really gave them that provisional understanding. So in my review of 30, 40 years of engagement with the Chinese on the South China Sea issue, I can't see any hint of compromise, any hint of cooperation, right? We get tricked all the time that China is interested in confidence-building measures, when in fact, I think China's goal is to create a false impression that it's willing to compromise and cooperate to evade accountability, so we lessen the pressure.
You say we get tricked all the time, but isn't that more an us problem rather than it is a them problem, right? So, Admiral, is this issue that we're talking about more about, not just about, or more about the strengths of China, or is it really about the weakness of the Philippines?
I realized that when the question has evolved, talking about the government, it usually ends on my part. Right? It should have been given to Professor De Castro.
I mean, he's going to answer it too,
But I'll respond to the earlier question.
Sige
Is
na
there,
nga, you get a pass.
is there a reason for us to be afraid with China? I don't think that, me personally, I'm not afraid of China for two good reasons. One, even if we recognize China that they have a massive military capability, even if they are the economic powerhouse right now, it's still not enough for me to be threatened regarding our position in the West Philippine Sea. President Duterte, during most of his years as the president, has been threatening the Filipino people that we cannot stand up for our rights in the West Philippine Sea because in just a matter of days, we will be invaded. It will be bloody. There will be war. But it never happened. For more than 3 years already, our current government is standing up for our rights in the West Philippine Sea, and there are no reported incident of invasion. It's always below the threshold of armed attack. It's always below the threshold of kinetic conflict. Because China is more afraid of having a kinetic conflict than President Duterte ever had, right? Secondly, I'm not afraid because I'm a believer of the international law. We have many lawyers here, and we also have international experts supporting the rules-based order. I don't think we have a reason to be afraid because our assertion of our rights, standing up for our sovereignty and sovereign rights, is all in accordance with international law. We're not doing anything that undermines the position of other country. We're actually pusher of the international law. So there's no reason for us to be afraid.
Thanks so much. Professor De Castro, your answer, is China a monster that we should be afraid of? And also a follow-up, is this more of an us problem rather than a China problem?
Number one, of course, I don't want to look at China as a monster. It is an emergent power. It has interest, but of course its interest is more expansive than ours. It's a bigger country, it has a huge economy, it has a huge military. So I look at it as an emergent power that is really clashing. Its interest, in a way, clashes with our interests. For them, South China Sea, West Philippine Sea has to be controlled, something that we have to be wary of. They have developed the capability to do so. You will not build the largest navy in the world. You won't have the biggest shipbuilding industry. You will not build a navy if you're not thinking in terms of maritime expansion. So in a way, I am wary of this confident, expansive power that is right inside our neighborhood. So that really gives me a sleepless night. The fact that the geopolitical flashpoint in the 21st century is right in our neighborhood. We're faced by two major flashpoints: West Philippine Sea, South China Sea, and of course, north of us is Taiwan. That makes me extremely wary, not afraid, but wary of what China will do in the near future.
All right, thanks a lot. We've run out of time. We have a 15-minute break, but before we get into that, I want to thank Professor De Castro, Rear Admiral Tariela, Ambassador Laura, who's very, very honest. Thank you for your candor and your honesty. Of course, Dr. Jeffrey or Danielle. We are going to have a 15-minute break. We'll meet up here again for the town hall meeting. Thanks again, guys. See you in a bit.